I literally walked out of my where I'm staying, this backpacker hotel, and then I'm looking, just doing some birding while waiting for Jaden to show up. And I run into this gentleman who is cycling and birding, and I just had to talk to him.
You are listening to Urban Wildlife Podcast.
Hey podcast listeners, this is one of your co-hosts, Billy Brown. It's just me this episode, at least during the intro, because you're going to hear Tony in a little bit. Before we get to Tony's adventures in Australia, let's take care of the routine reminders. First, if you like the podcast, please rate us in your podcasting platform of choice. Please also let your friends know about it through whatever means possible, whether that's actual like person-to-person conversation, passing them notes, Snapchat, Facebook, Twitter, you name it. Let them know about the podcast so they can listen to it also. Please feel free to get in touch with us. You can send us an email at urbanwildlifecast@gmail.com. You can tweet at us at urbwildlifecast. You can find us on Facebook pretty easily. Please let us know what you think about the show. Let us know any ideas for stories that you think we should do. We absolutely love it when we get ideas and content from people who listen to the podcast. So please get in touch. So without much further ado, we're going to start off with Tony talking to an imperial pigeon researcher he just happened to run into. Because that's what happens when you're Tony and you're walking around a city. You run into wildlife researchers.
All right, so I'm here in Cairns. I literally walked out of my where I'm staying, this backpacker hotel, and then I'm looking, just doing some birding while waiting for Jaden to show up. And I run into this gentleman who is cycling and birding, and I just had to talk to him. Turns out he's doing a Teresian imperial pigeon survey, nesting survey. So why don't you tell us who you are, what you're doing, and what the importance of the study is?
Yes, well, I've been doing this survey, and it's part of a 50-year-old survey now, which was started as a pigeon count when these Teresian imperial pigeons were hunted to the brink of extinction by sports shooters in the 1950s. Anyway, this pigeon count has persisted ever since and still going today, and it counts the birds as they go to roost on the offshore islands. And, you know, numbers like 30,000 appear on the data sheets and things like that. But when Cyclone Yasi wiped out all the vegetation on the offshore islands, that number plummeted to 5,000 in the first count after Cyclone Yasi. And coincidentally, they turned up in Cairns City nesting. Prior to Cyclone Yasi, 10 or a dozen nests would be the most you'd ever find in Cairns City. Post Cyclone Yasi, I was getting between 300 and 400 nests a year. And last season I got 712 nests. And this is with just cycling around, cursory recording, not exhaustive searching, and just recording the nests, GPS point, species of tree they nest in, a bit of other relative data. And I'll just keep an eye on whatever nests I can, because we're trying to work out what the success rate of this move onshore is, what sort of predation they're experiencing, their persistence. Will they persist, or will they move back to the islands now that the vegetation has come back to the islands? And it would seem that they like it in the city, so they're still here. And one thought is that the reason they nest on the offshore islands is that the ocean gives them a moat of protection, and perhaps the urban sprawl gives them a similar mode of protection. But I have noticed a build-up in raptors in Cairns since this has happened. But anyway, all my data goes into the big data bank that's being run by an adjunct professor at the James Cook University now, Dr. Julia Hazel, and she has all the data, that 50-year data, in the bank as well. So this just provides us with an opportunity to look at the nesting without having to go and live on one of the offshore islands for 6 months of the year. So it's just an opportunity that's presented itself, and I use it as my exercise.
I gotta say, I love urban wildlife. I travel all over the world. About 48 countries I've been to, and I gotta say, Cairns, I think, has got to be the greatest city I've ever visited for urban wildlife.
Yes, yes. Much to the annoyance of the local council, I can tell you. Yes.
Wow, thank you so much. That was so fortuitous.
Next up, Tony is going to be talking to another researcher he ran into, this time in Sydney, talking about a wide variety of Sydney wildlife.
Those are all urban wildlife. So I found you yesterday because I had seen a wing-flagged Australian white ibis at walking around the shops at Darling Harbour, and I was like, someone has to be studying urban Australian white ibis if there's wing flags on it. And then I don't know if that was actually one of your birds, because me and my friend started Googling that, and I couldn't find anything about you with wing flags, but I found about you in bands. So I don't know. Do you know who did that bird? Is that one of yours?
It's one of mine. Yeah.
72?
72 yellow.
You familiar with? So what's 72? So tell me about. Well, actually, first let's introduce yourself, your title, what you do, and then we'll start with the ibises.
Okay. Dr. John Martin. I'm a wildlife ecologist. I'm a research scientist here in the Royal Botanic Garden, Sydney. I spend a bit of time working with a range of urban fauna, with a bit of an emphasis on human-wildlife conflict. So I'm interested in those species that people tend to think are a bit of a nuisance.
So you were exactly the person that I needed to find when I was here in Sydney.
It was a fluke, but here we are having a coffee.
And this is awesome, and it was one of your birds that brought me to you.
Yeah, they are messengers. Yeah. So in the bigger picture, the Australian white ibis is a species that has changed its behaviour. If we went back 30 years ago, and you saw an Australian white ibis in the Sydney CBD area where you saw one yesterday, that would have been really rare. And if you're a birdo, you'd have rung up your mates and gone, "Come down, check out this amazing bird. It's a rare sighting." You'd get the twitches coming in. But what's happened over that 30-year period is we've gone from having a few hundred Australian white ibis in urban Sydney to having over 9,000 Australian white ibis in urban Sydney. And they have adapted to nest in habitat like palm trees, which
I saw a nest yesterday, yeah.
Yep, they wouldn't traditionally have ever nested in palm trees. They traditionally nest in wetlands where they crush down the emergent vegetation and they build those floating raft nests.
Wow, that's a huge difference.
Yeah, and then the bins and scavenging for people and foraging in landfills. So they've had a real change, and so what's driven that change is in their traditional habitats, which is the Murray-Darling Basin. It's a huge area, like 1 million square kilometres. It's our agricultural food bowl in Australia, and so we've dammed the rivers, we've extracted water for agriculture and for towns, and we've had really reduced environmental flows. So those wetlands don't have the floods that they used to. And so I actually say to people they're a messenger species, because they're the one species that in the urban environment we see regularly that is actually waving the flag saying, "Hey, I'm here because you stuffed up the habitat." Where the other species, we don't see them in, that they haven't shifted to change their behaviour and their habitat.
That's amazing. Yeah, there's always a human element to, whenever you see urban wildlife, and something becomes a nuisance species, and people are like, hating on them, like Canada geese back in.
Yep.
You're like, well, if you look at the story, it's people are at the fault. In the case of Canada geese, it's because you're allowed to use live decoys up until 30s, and then they outlawed the practice, so they just let the geese go that they had as live decoys, and geese don't. They're entrained to the daylight and they get restless, but they don't know where to migrate. That's taught. So they didn't just suddenly be like, "Oh, we're free. We're going to fly back up to Quebec."
Yep.
Right. So they just stayed.
and then also they were intentionally released in places that didn't have a migratory population. So this nuisance bird has a, it's human origin, so it's just like the ibis. In this case, not like they were released, but they had a shift.
Actually, there is a funny backstory, which is if you go back into the 60s, there was a wildlife sanctuary in Victoria called Hillsville Sanctuary, and they got some chicks out of a nest in the wild, brought them to the sanctuary, and then they survived, which was fine. They reproduced. It was a success story, one of the early captive breedings of native Australian birds in captivity. And then they kept breeding. And to the point where they decided, we've got too many of them in the sanctuary, we need to do something about it. And so they did things like destroying the eggs to stop them having more chicks. But then eventually they decided, we'll give some of them to other wildlife sanctuaries. And so they gave some to Taronga Zoo here in Sydney in 1973, to Tidbinbilla Sanctuary in Canberra, and Currumbin Sanctuary on the Gold Coast in Queensland. Anyway, in Taronga, there was 14 pairs released as a liberty flock. They didn't put them in a cage, they just released them in the zoo.
Wow.
And arguably, that seeded this urban population. So it's not that they all mated and we have 9,000 from 14 pairs.
Right.
It's that what this bird did do is they did disperse, they did move, but they also brought other birds back. So that knowledge transfer of, hey, there's good habitat here.
Wow.
Now, a lot of this is implied, the knowledge transfer, but we know that they didn't breed from 14 pairs to 9,000 birds.
Yeah.
Because we do have data showing them moving, and hence the wing tag shows them moving across larger geographic distances.
So, for instance, yellow 72,
Yep.
right? Male or female?
It's a female, so it's shorter bill, slightly smaller bird. You get the larger males with a longer bill.
Oh, interesting.
Yep.
So, where was she first tagged, and where she moved?
Yeah, so that yellow tag indicates the bird was tagged in the city, which is here at the Botanic Garden, just up the road at Hyde Park. So literally, I'd go out and catch these birds while people are having their lunch. Business people would come down from the skyscrapers, they're sitting on the lawn having a nice lunch in the sunshine, and I would, the ibis are mixing around in between these people to scavenge some food. And I'd go and actually catch some birds in front of these people, which was quite funny because a lot of the people get quite surprised when suddenly a bird gets caught and someone's standing there holding
this bird. You have a hand net?
Actually, foot noose them.
Oh, okay.
So they're it can be quite the show. Anyway, it's a very effective method because they're used to coming up to people to get food.
Right.
And so that bird was wing tagged actually here in the Botanic Garden 3 years ago. And what we've been doing with those birds is actually more recently tagging juvenile birds to look at natal filipatry. So do those birds disperse long distances, or do they actually hang around in the habitat where they were born? And so we see that a large proportion of those birds aren't moving. They've got the good life. So rather than doing what they traditionally did, so you go back to these inland wetlands, it was a boom-bust cycle of flooding, and then the flood would disappear, so the birds would have to disperse. And there's data showing that juvenile birds would disperse even up to Papua New Guinea, so a couple of thousand kilometres away. But what we see now is that a lot of these juvenile birds don't disperse. And there are some birds that we've been monitoring over the last 10 years that we see regularly in our surveys, and we've gone and put GPS transmitters on them, and we're getting multiple fixes a day, and it shows that they literally, over a multiple month period, don't move more than 2 kilometres. It's as if they're not flying.
Wow.
They can fly, but they just get all their resources by just walking around between the parks. They have a short flight over a road to another park, and they're just bouncing around.
My last visit to Florida, I had better birding in the cities than in the Everglades.
Yeah, really?
Yeah, the sewage treatment plants at Palm Beach had better, had huge wading bird colonies that you could just walk through boardwalks around.
Sewage treatment plants are a gold mine in two senses. So, but yes, the birds are definitely the one that we're interested in.
So, man, I could just so much, like your little blurb on your on the Botanic Garden page was like, I could have done probably 6 interviews with you out of that, like, because you also study powerful owls, flying foxes, red foxes.
Yep.
And what else?
Sulphur-crested cockatoos, yellow-tailed black cockatoos, do some eastern grey kangaroos, swamp wallabies.
Like, wow, like I don't even know where to begin with all that. Is there any of those? I mean, anybody listening to this would find that interesting that all those are. Well, foxes are pretty ubiquitous in urban areas now, but they're not native here, so that's interesting in itself. But then those other animals, for instance, sulphur-crested cockatoo, aren't they? I heard that they're not actually native to Sydney. Is that true? That they were brought in?
So when you go way back to the early records, they weren't seen commonly in the area where we are right now, but they were seen. That was an ibis.
Yeah, there's an ibis right behind us. So we're at the cafe at the garden.
But the sulphur-crested cockatoos did occur in this area. So they actually occurred in the greater Sydney region. So Western Sydney, so 40 k's from here, there's an area called the Cumberland Plain Woodland. They would occur in that area. So they are definitely native to this area, but similar to the Australian white ibis, they've expanded their distribution, they've increased their numbers in urban environments. One of the things that's most novel about that species, it's just similar to the ibis, is the adaptation of scavenging from people. Now, people don't use that term scavenging because people love this species.
Right.
Some people hate them as well. But
I mean, it has the most horrific call of any bird ever. So I can see people have mixed feelings about it. While this bird is extremely charismatic and beautiful, it sounds like a pterodactyl.
it does sound like a pterodactyl. I'll pull it up here. But look, so the thing is, they will go and feed from people. So they're happy to even sit on your shoulder, and you know that's not a problem for them. That's part of just what they do. It's very loud when they're right in your ear, sitting on your shoulder.
Yeah, it's the stuff of nightmares. It's almost as bad as... Well, your barn owls here don't sound as crazy as the ones we have.
No, they just sound like owls.
Yeah. Our barn owls sound like a murder.
Well, you know, there's that whole woman being killed in the forest.
Yeah.
But it's just the barn owls.
But they split them, so you're the eastern barn owl and western. And...
There's this big desert in the way.
Yeah.
So it's caused some speciation.
Yeah.
But yeah, so with the sulphurs, it's really interesting because they're a hollow nesting species. And of course, in urban areas, we cut down trees. There are a lot less trees. So the other thing we do is there's a risk of trees failing. So if there's a hollow forming in a tree, it's considered a weakness. So quite commonly, these trees with hollows are actually cut down because they're seen as potentially going to fall on a house or on a car or on a person. But their numbers are increasing. And you know, so we've actually got a wing tagging program for them as well, so we're engaging the community, so a citizen science project, and people can report their sightings of these wing tagged birds. And you know, we've had over 15,000 sightings by members of the community. It was just blown us away. And because these birds are going onto people's balconies or in their gardens, and the people are hand feeding them peanuts or biscuits and things like this, which they shouldn't necessarily be doing, but you know, people get this interaction with these birds. That being said, you know, if an ibis goes to someone's backyard, they tend to get shooed away.
Yeah.
But
I mean, I think they're equally awesome looking, but I guess they're, you know, this thing with a naked head is
what are you saying about bald people? No, so look, you're right. The Australian white ibis, it stands about 60 to 70 centimetres tall. It's got these long legs that look sort of reptilian.
Yeah.
You know, they've got scales on them. They've got this bald head, black leathery skin, and this black down-curved bill. They can have a bill up to 20 centimetres long. So, you know, they will go up to people and try to get them to drop some food or give them some food. And you know, I do find it humorous because we've changed our behaviour. Once upon a time, a bird came up to you, you would have just gone and eaten it. You know, you would have hunted that. Nowadays, of course, we actually, you see people running in fear from a bird that only weighs 2 kilos. You know?
Yeah. It's funny. And so powerful owls. Let's talk about powerful owls. Man, there's so much to talk to you about. But so powerful owls are your largest owl.
They are, yes. So they're nowhere near as big as what you guys get in the States.
Great horns.
Yeah, great horns. Yep. So
I'm
these
assuming
ones,
it's about the comparable to a barred owl, is my guess.
yeah, they get up to 2 kilo, so a bit less than that, maybe 1.6 kilos. So what's that for you guys? So 3 pounds, something like that.
That's still significant. You know, it's still pretty big. I mean, it's not. The great horn's not twice as big. It's just like 1.5.
Yeah, no, they're big. So what we see with them in the urban environment, again, it's an odd species. They're actually listed as vulnerable to extinction because of loss of habitat, so cutting down forests for agriculture and for urban development. They're a hollow nesting owl. So,
Yeah, back to this sulfur crested. So
Yep.
where do sulfur crested and because they're not actually sulfur crested and powerful owl probably fairly similar in size.
well, sulfurs are about 800 to 1,000 grams, so 1 kilogram.
So they're like twice as big.
Yeah, so the powerful owl is about twice as big, but the birds standing next to each other, it's not that. It's just the owl's actually a lot more structurally.
Right.
You know, it's twice as wide.
But they probably need similar sized cavities, bigger cavities.
They
right?
compete for cavities, yeah, they do. The owls technically need a larger one, but the sulfurs will use the same
Right.
cavities.
And so, with studying the sulfurs, did you find where are they nesting? Like, have they changed to nesting in different things?
Yeah, so a colleague of mine who I work with on the sulfurs, Dr. Adrian Davis, he's done some work and he's found that the sulfurs are the bullies in the urban environment. They're excluding other species like powerful owls and things like the brush-tailed possum, which is a cat-sized marsupial that actually is omnivorous and will eat eggs and chicks and things like this, but they'll actually exclude them out from using hollows, which they breed in and they actually den in each night. And so there's this nice little triangle between those three species because powerful owls will eat both sulfur-crested cockatoos and the brush-tailed possums. Brush-tailed possum is sort of 3 kilo.
Yeah.
So, powerful owls, maybe 1,600, 1,800 grams, is carrying a mammal twice its size that it's caught in the canopy of a tree.
Wow.
Yeah, so they've got these massive talons. Very impressive. But that being said, sulfur-crested cockatoos will exclude both of those other species from hollows because they'll work as a team. And they do scream at them. It's not that they bite them and attack them.
Yeah.
It's really just, it's a mobbing sort of thing. So then the animal just goes, all right, I'll get out of here. I'll go.
You can seriously probably take sulfur-crested cockatoo recordings and put them on like speakers and like riot control vehicles and get people to disperse.
Look, they do have an amazing call.
Yeah.
Yeah. You get up close to a couple. Experience the scream.
Powerful owls, what are they? So they're vulnerable throughout the country, but they're doing pretty well in cities?
Well, so BirdLife Australia, BirdLife International, if you're familiar with them, they've been doing a citizen science program, getting people to go out and actually listen for the owls calling to identify owls in the urban environment and, associated with woodland patches interspersed in suburbia. And so it's been really successful. So this year they recorded 53 chicks being born, and that's just in the Sydney region.
Wow.
So, Sydney's the biggest city in Australia. There's like 4 million people here. But we've got this vulnerable woodland apex predator, nocturnal predator, that's sharing our city with us. A lot of people wouldn't even know.
And you don't even, if I'm not mistaken, I looked online and I was actually surprised. I looked at the acreage that you have, or the hectareage you have in Sydney, and it's not actually that much parkland. So it's not that these birds are like for instance, my park that I personally, my office is 1,900 acres.
Okay.
And we have lots of great horns in there.
Yep.
But it's a massive park. These owls are nesting not in big, huge parks, right? They're nesting in like yards, right? You don't have that much big parkland for them to nest in, right?
Yeah, so surrounding Sydney there are big national parks. So
Right.
they're, square kilometres of just, areas that haven't been changed. But the urban footprint is a huge sprawl of suburbia. And so, there's vegetation associated with like gullies and little creek lines and things like that. And that's where the owls are. And that's because that's where the big trees have been retained. They do occur in some urban parks. So we're sitting here on Sydney Harbour in the middle of the CBD in the Botanic Garden. This is a 60 hectare, so...
we're a 5-minute walk from the Opera House.
Yeah, so 360 acres ish. And there's a pair of owls here. Sometimes we see up to 4 owls here because birds disperse through. The owls are here because there's food. So because of all the vegetation being in a botanic garden, there's lots of possums. There's lots of ringtail possums and brush-tail possums. There's flying foxes in the area because there's food, so they come in at night so the owls can eat them. And of course there's other birds which they eat as well, so things like the sulphur-crested cockatoos, but other things around. What we see, because you can see them, this is one of the few species that actually sits on its prey. So during the day you can go look at it and see that it's sitting on a possum or sitting on a flying fox.
Like, all the pictures you see of them has a possum in its talons.
Yeah. So it's interesting, and you see that possums and flying foxes are what we see them eating here a lot. But the other thing, which is part of their urban adaptation, they eat black rats. So the rats that have been introduced to the country, which thrive in cities, they will actually grab them out of canopies, and so they do forage naturally, even though they're here in an urban setting. They'll forage in the cafe here or the bins, you know what I mean. But they're also in the surrounding vegetation, and the owls grab them out of there.
Wow!
And they can get pretty big.
How about speaking of like scavenging, prey in an urban environment got me thinking about wedge-tailed eagles, because I saw a few of them on my trip, and they're all eating roadkill.
Yep.
Have they come into cities at all eating roadkill, or they still need big open areas?
Yeah, we don't see them in the Sydney area often. There is a species called a white-bellied seagull. It's only just smaller than the wedge-tailed eagle. You do see them, so you see them flying over here sometimes.
The same genus, for our listeners, the same genus as bald eagle.
Yep. So they breed down the Sydney Harbour, down the other end. It's called the Parramatta River, and there's a nest there where they're breeding. Out in Western Sydney, I see more whistling kites and things like that. So little eagles, but not the wedgies. But yeah, I guess the thing is, there's probably not that much roadkill. There's probably more roadkill when you get further out of the city.
Yeah.
Because in the city, we've already killed everything.
Yeah.
Anyway, there's actually a lot of wildlife in the city.
Yeah.
But you know what I mean.
Not the big macropods that are going to be eaten on the highway.
No. So
that's in the yellowtail blacks. What's their story?
Yeah, look, so they're an interesting one. They're actually not so much an urban adapter, but they do come into the area. They're a larger cockatoo, like the sulphur-crested cockatoo. They've got this amazingly powerful beak. They get pine cones and just rip them open and eat the seeds. The other parrots, like sulphur-crested cockatoos or corellas and galahs, will then eat some of the remnants that they've dropped because they don't have the equipment to actually crunch into those unopened pine cones. The other thing that the yellowtail black cockatoos do is they'll literally rip branches open to eat the grubs that they can hear inside the branches.
Oh wow!
So yeah, they're actually it's something you don't think a lot about, but parrots eating protein. And so they come into the Sydney region seasonally for the pine cones that have been planted on things like Pinus radiata, so introduced species that have been planted in urban areas. There are species that the data suggests is declining. And again, it's always habitat loss. We clear a lot of land for agriculture and for urban areas, and so there's less forest that has food for them. They're also a hollow nesting species. So, I've got this citizen science program called Hollows as Homes, trying to get the community to report tree hollows in their backyard, in their street, because the loss of hollows is actually a threatening process nationally for heaps of species. But yeah, so the yellowtails, they're quite cool. We see them come in each sort of winter for this food resource, and so this year we actually caught 10 birds and fitted them with GPS transmitters to see where they're going. And so currently they've moved a couple of 100 kilometres away south, but still using a lot of urban areas. So it's quite surprising. We'll do a habitat analysis of the patches they're using. A couple of them have gone really bush, and they're probably breeding birds. They've gone to spots where there's, because of their localised movements at the moment, it's the breeding season. But the other birds that seem to be dispersing are likely younger birds that are just out foraging. But some birds are still sitting around in eastern Sydney here in some of the highest density living areas, still foraging on native Banksia. And so the coastal heathland is a vegetation community called Eastern Eastern Suburbs Banksia Scrub. And so the Banksias are, they flower, they produce these cones with lots of seeds, and those cones sit on the trees for even years waiting for a fire. So the birds, it's like a buffet that they'll just come back to eat those seeds.
But I got briefly distracted because there's automatic doors in this cafe, and common mynas are flying in when the doors open to feed off of tables and flying back out. And
Scavenging.
Yeah.
So that's the introduced common myna, otherwise known as an Indian myna locally here. So it did get introduced from the subcontinent. But there is a species, also a hollow nester, incidentally. But there are species that it's funny that we've got a native species called a noisy myna, and there's a big confusion because
but M-I-N-E-R.
Yeah.
But is that like a bastardization of myna? They look like mynas, even though they're honey eaters.
Yeah, it is a bastardization,
right?
But it's and so it is that confusion in the community where they never really see the name written; they just talk about it. And so myna. But so a lot of people don't like the native one because they're also an abundant, aggressive species. But then you talk to them and go, well, which one don't you like? They say, oh, the grey one. You go, well, that's the native. They're like, no. So it's really interesting how much people really engage with the species they do or they like or dislike. Sometimes they don't know their names.
Yeah. Did you your PhD, was that on urban wildlife, or is that?
It's on our beautiful Australian white ibis. Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So I was.
So this is your thing. Like you are an urban. You're meant for this job. You're an urban wildlife guy. That's awesome.
Yeah, I do some remote stuff as well. But yeah,
you gotta get that. You gotta get it.
You gotta go bush now and then.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So no, I definitely urban wildlife is really interesting. That issue of human wildlife conflict, but also the behavioural adaptation.
Yeah.
All these species, it's not normal for them to have no fear factor of humans. We're an apex predator. And once upon a time, we would have had very different interactions with all these species we're talking about if you could catch them. If they were close enough, they're all just food.
Well, right now is the time of year people do Christmas bird counts.
Yes.
Right?
CBC.
And that's from an American tradition where we'd go out and shoot everything we saw in one day. And they were like, why don't you count them instead? So, until very recently, all these birds would have been food.
Yeah, well. The thing that was just amazing then, as you were saying that, was those miners both triggered the motion door activator and then flew out. That was on the sliding door. So that is smart.
Yeah.
But you look, that's a fantastic evolution of the CBC from shooting to counting.
Yeah. I'm sad to miss it while I'm here. I've been going. I've missed some here or there, but I've been doing it, for like 25 years or more with my dad, and I have to miss it. But it was funny. I got like a whole pile of my friends that go do it with him without me.
Okay, they'll fill in for you.
Yeah.
So so one of the things that is also really interesting for me is, for instance, your podcast. So it's talking to people or communicating to people about things that are in their world, in their surroundings. And so one of the big things with all these species that seem to be overabundant or behaving badly, nuisance species, is really that opportunity to actually engage with the community and talk with them about these species. A lot of people, when you tell them that the Australian white ibis is a native species, because they don't call them the Australian white ibis, they call them a bin chicken or a tip turkey or that white bird. And you go through the description and then you say, oh, that's an ibis. And they go, oh yeah, I don't like them. And then you go, do you know they're native? And a lot of people say no. And that's because they used to be called the sacred ibis. So there was a lot of, they used to be perceived as an introduced species. And so, that changes people's perception straight away. Oh, it's a native species. And then you say, oh, well, do you know why it's here? The habitat loss. And that's change of species. Then you talk about things like the powerful owl. And people just get blown away. There's this big owl that eats possums flying around in the city where they are just walking around. They're just cool birds. These cool species.
All right, next up, Tony goes on a herping trip This is the part where I got really jealous. Not that like going to Australia for almost a month wasn't enough to make me jealous, but in this case, Tony goes out herping, and so we're going to hear him sort of talking on the intro to the herping trip, and then afterwards, sort of a summary recap of the herping trip.
Alrighty, I'm here with my dude Rob Hinson, and we are in Sydney, driving to another part of Sydney, right? We're not actually leaving Sydney, or is that? I'm not quite sure.
We're staying in Sydney.
Yes,
There's
and
no sign saying goodbye, thank you for coming.
yeah, the definitions of what's in Australia, the word suburb means subdivision of a city. So you could be right in the downtown of Sydney and live in a suburb. So it's a little confusing as to what's the city and what's not, because if you say you live in the suburbs, you could literally live in like right by the big buildings and not actually live in a area that looks like traditional suburbs to me. So we're going to a park that's within the city limits of Sydney to do some herping by spotlight, and maybe we'll see some other things like sugar gliders, possums, anything else you might see, Rob?
Geckos, frogs, hopefully giant burrowing frogs, echidnas.
This will be awesome. So this is the last hurrah of a month stay in Australia for me. Most of it wasn't particularly urban. We were in far north Queensland, and we went to look for some birds. It was mostly a birding trip, but we did spotlight. We were looking for everything we could see. But we went to some national parks in far north Queensland, and trying to get the specialty birds there. Birds that either you can only find them in Australia there, or they only live there. Some of the birds are shared with New Guinea. We also spent some time I spent some time on the way up in this place called the Cassowary House in Corunda, where I did see cassowaries and a lot of other things, and a tree kangaroo, but that was in a national park outside the town. And on the way back we went to Mount Lewis, which is it actually in Athens and Tablelands, Mount Lewis?
Yeah.
Which is another area which is full of endemic birds, like totally 100% endemic Australian birds, shared with nowhere else. And they're really cool, like golden bowerbird, tooth-billed catbird, Atherton scrub wren, fern wren, chinchilla, a bunch of other great stuff. We also saw that white-tailed rat.
Giant white-tailed rat.
Giant white-tailed rat, which is cool to see a non-marsupial in Australia. It's pretty cool. Fawn-footed Melamus, which is basically an arboreal rat. Was really cool to see. We also saw red-footed pademelons, which is a small rainforest kangaroo. I saw musky rat kangaroos in that same general vicinity before. But let's talk about the jumping off point for anything Expeditions North, the city of Cairns. So Cairns is a small city that I guess focuses on Great Barrier Reef tourism, and the wildlife that you can see in this city is spectacular. Rob, would you, as our local Australian, would you like to talk about some of the stuff we saw in Cairns?
Yeah, well, Cairns is very different to most of the bigger cities like Sydney and Melbourne. You're right on the sea, and there's terrific mudflats. It's one of the best places in Australia to see shorebirds, or waders as some people call them here. There's also a lot of reasonably intact native habitat in and around the city. So the mangroves hold mangrove robins and various other honeyeaters and butcher birds. The esplanade, which you walk along to see the shorebirds, has peaceful doves just at your feet, which is pretty amazing because normally they're a little bit shy. There's fig parrots feeding in the trees around you, varied honey eaters, a whole host of birds, and a lot of species that you would typically, if you're in a bigger city, you would have to go out of the city, maybe half an hour to an hour out of the city to see that sort of variety of species. But Cairns is pretty unique in the sense that right in the city, or within 5 minutes of the centre of that city, you've got all of those birds right on your doorstep.
Yeah, I'd say I probably got 20 species of bird that I didn't get elsewhere on the trip. Right in Cairns.
Yeah, that's about right. And they're all pretty easy, because I think they're just accustomed to humans as well. So you've got bush stone curlews running around at night on the lawns and on the streets and on the roads of the city itself. And to see a bird like that from Sydney, you might have to go 2 or 3 hours, and they would be very difficult to see.
Also, the 2 or 3 species of flying fox.
Yeah, there was spectacled, little red, and I think Jaden had some blacks as well, all in the city. Sydney's quite famous for the grey-headed flying foxes, and we occasionally get blacks, but we're at the southern end of their range.
And I think Brisbane gets flying foxes as well too, right?
Brisbane gets certainly black. I'm not sure if it gets grey-headed. It might get little reds.
So it's pretty amazing when you just walk around the city and you see this massive bat flying over. It literally looks like the Batman symbols in the sky above you. And sometimes they can fly really high up too.
They can be pretty high up. They can be feeding the trees right above you, and they're communal roosters. So when they come out for the night at dusk, there might be several thousand just erupting from their roosting trees just as it's getting dark, which is quite a sight.
Now, we didn't see this bird, but if I'm not mistaken, one of the birds we're looking for, Powerful Owl, is a specialist on flying foxes, right? And you can find them in cities sometimes, feeding on flying fox colonies. Is that correct?
Yeah, so there's Powerful Owls in the Royal Botanical Gardens in Sydney, and they often will feed on possums, but they're adaptable. And certainly in the Royal Botanical Gardens, where there used to be a large colony of grey-headed flying foxes, it was very common to find one with a dead flying fox in its talons in the morning from its night's hunting.
And in tropical coastal Australia, the rufous owl takes over that role, right?
That's right, and they're seen in many urban areas, such as along the Esplanade in Cairns, in Darwin, up at the Botanical Gardens. They're often seen.
We met this amazingly cool nature photography couple, Jazz and Matt, when we were up in Queensland, and they just had a photograph of a rufous owl in Townsville. So that's another city that I hear is really good for urban wildlife that I got to check out. I have a friend there, so when I come back, I'll have to check that out. Although this country is so massive, it's hard to go everywhere.
You've done pretty well so far.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. So yeah, and also we already recorded an interview with a gentleman studying the Torresian imperial pigeons that nest in Cairns. That's pretty unique and amazing. That was literally the first bird I think I saw when I got off the plane. I saw this black and white pigeon fly by, and I was like, "Whoa, is that an imperial pigeon? This is crazy." So yeah, Cairns was incredible. And they have crocs right off in the harbor too. We didn't see them, but apparently they're there. There's warning signs for them all over. So why don't you tell us a little bit about Sydney and the urban wildlife that you see in Sydney?
So Sydney's, it's not quite as exciting as Cairns in the sense that you have many, many species right in the middle of the city or within just minutes of the centre of the city. But there are a few pretty special species, not necessarily just birds. Probably the most interesting bird in the city are the Powerful Owls. And there's Powerful Owls in the Royal Botanical Gardens, which is literally minutes from the Sydney Harbour Bridge and just a few metres from the Opera House. Most people who go to the Botanical Gardens go there via the Opera House.
As did I.
As did Tony.
For that interview that you'll also hear in this episode.
So powerful owl is probably the most iconic Australian species that we have in the city. One thing that surprises a lot of foreign birders is we have ibises right in the city, on the streets. They usually feed on the leftovers from the public, chips and stuff. They've not evolved, but they have utilised their very long bill to feed from rubbish bins. Typically ibis, if you go to America or Europe, you get them in marshes and wetlands. It's quite a surprise to see them right in the middle of the city. I think there's some in Africa that do something similar. And parrots, there's quite a few parrots that we get in the city. Cockatoos, again, you see them all over the city. You get them in Hyde Park, in the botanical gardens. Occasionally little corellas are right in the city. And rainbow lorikeets, one of the most beautiful parrots we have, are found all over the city. As long as there's flowering trees for them to feed on, they don't care that there's skyscrapers and shopping malls all over the place. They've got some food, so they're happy.
And they're absolutely one of the most common birds you encounter in Sydney, if not.
Yeah, I mean, there's quite large roosts of them, actually near quite a few shopping centres and train stations, and they're very noisy at night. They'll chatter on all through the night and make an awful racket. But yeah, you can see thousands of them at some of these roosts. So that's really it for birds. There's a few other bird species that you get in the city. You get Australian ravens and magpies, currawongs, magpie larks. In some of the urban parks, such as Sydney Park in Newtown, we have species like Latham's snipe, which breeds in Japan and spends its winter down in Sydney, or throughout Australia really. We often get up to 5 each summer at Sydney Park. Other birds you get at Sydney Park, we've had stilts breeding there successfully. Black-fronted dotterels have bred and get galahs, occasionally a red-rump parrot. The other day with Tony we had a buff-banded rail. That's also another species that you get in the botanical gardens right next to the Opera House, is buff-banded rails. Rails tend to be pretty difficult to see, but you can come to Sydney and a few other cities in Australia and you can see them in the parks, which is pretty neat. But the thing we're doing tonight, we're going to the worst kept secret in Sydney herpetological circles. It's a secret spot just in the northern parts of the city to look for reptiles. So Australia has huge diversity in reptiles, and we're looking for snakes and geckos tonight, and also legless lizards. And one of our biggest targets, and this secret site is famous for, is death adders. If you have a reasonably warm night over 23 degrees centigrade, you've got a pretty good chance of seeing a death adder. Other species we're hoping to see are bandies, black and white stripes, and they do this funny defensive posturing where they raise part of their body up. It's quite entertaining. It's not particularly threatening to humans. Have a funny diet of blind snakes. They are thought to exclusively feed on blind snakes. Other species that we're looking for are diamond pythons, which are fairly regular in and around Sydney. Golden crown snakes, which a few of my friends who live in the city have seen them in their gardens or on their driveways, and one of my friends has only seen one, and that was in his house, which is rather amusing for his wife. There's occasionally tiger snakes in this park, but they tend to be diurnal, so we don't see them at night very often. There's marsh snakes, occasionally red-bellied black snakes at night. There's about 3 species of geckos that we'll get. And there's also quite a few frog species. One of the ones we're really looking for is a huge frog called a giant burrowing frog, which we tend to get after rains, but we haven't had much rain recently, but there have been some sighted. So hopefully we can get one of these giant burrowing frogs for you, Tony.
That would be awesome. And hopefully when we do this on the way back, we'll talk about all we've seen. I'll do a little wrap up. Cool. Well, that's good for now, and then we'll talk more when we get there.
Oh yeah.
All right. So, we haven't. I'm here with my friend Jaden Walsh. Right, that's correct pronunciation. And remind me of your name again.
Liam Goring.
And Rob's still with us. So Jaden was with us on our Cape York expedition, and he met me in Cairns, and we had a good time birding around Cairns. So why don't you give us a rundown of what we saw here on our fringes of Sydney herping run? Well, we didn't just herp, but we saw other things too. So why don't you tell us what we saw?
Yeah, well, it started off with a pretty hot day, so conditions were looking good for the night. We started off seeing a bandy, which is a leopard, but it's not considered extremely dangerous to humans because they feed mainly upon blackish blind snakes in the Sydney region, so they don't need very strong venom. After that, we moved on to seeing and hearing, actually, first a couple of white-throated nightjars. We kept going, and then Rob spotted brown antechinus just scuttering around in the leaf litter.
And just so folks know, that's a small insectivorous marsupial.
Yeah, that's right. So they look a little bit like a mouse, but they've got a pointier snout and much sharper teeth, and they can be quite ferocious at times. And so we, And
we saw, two more of them throughout the night, right?
Yeah. And then we got down to a nice little stream, and there we saw some leaf green stream frogs, which are in the tree frog family. And they're quite cute little frogs, about 3 or 4 centimetres long, most of them. We got onto about 4 or 5 of them, and then on the way back we found a New Holland mouse, which is the second record in 13 years, and the first record was about 2 days before, so that was awesome. And we got great views of that feeding upon a Banksia integrifolia cone and getting seeds from the seed pod. And then, I think that kind of pretty much finished up our night until we got to the gate and we saw a broad-tailed gecko, which looks really similar to the leaf-tailed geckos and used to be in that same family, and they're one of Sydney's 4 gecko species that you get up here. And that finished off a great night herping.
Indeed, it was a good time. I had a great time in Australia. This is my last hurrah for natural history activities. Well, I head back to bed. I wake up, have breakfast with Rob's lovely family, and then head to the airport, where I may or may not get on a plane, and get on a different plane because they're talking about some switcheroo, give me a free flight deal. So I'll take it if that happens.
Good old Delta.
Yeah. I'll go on a racist tirade, though, and get kicked off forever. Or an anti-racist tirade. And they'll give me free flights forever. So do that. That'd be awesome. Cool. Well, Jaden, it was an absolute pleasure. I hope to see you again. And not that it wasn't a pleasure, but I just met you briefly.
Nice meeting you too.
But I wouldn't mind seeing you again, too. But Jaden, you're going to be my natural history brother forever. So hopefully we run into each other on this continent and other ones.
Yeah, it's been great.
Cheers.
All right, folks, thanks for listening to another episode, this special episode of the Urban Wildlife Podcast with Tony's Adventures in Australia. If you like the podcast, please rate us on your podcasting platform of choice. Please also let your friends know about it. You can use Snapchat, Facebook, Twitter. You can talk to people face-to-face. You can call people on the telephone. You can text your friends. You can hold up a sign telling the whole world that they should listen to the Urban Wildlife Podcast. If you want to get in touch with us, please do. Please let us know how you like the show. Please let us know any ideas you've got for other episodes or other topics. Please invite us to come to your city and go herping or go birding or do anything. In any case, you can email us at urbanwildlifecast@gmail.com. You can tweet at us at urbwildlifecast. You can pretty easily find us on Facebook and let us know what you think. And so we hope you like this episode, and please stay tuned for another episode coming up soon of the Urban Wildlife Podcast.